Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Memo in Conversation with podcast. I'm Alexander Morris. I'm a video producer and documentary maker, and we're here today with Hisham Al-Omeisy. He is a conflict analyst. He's currently based in Washington, DC, but has been in and out of Yemen throughout the conflict, and has been, following the peace negotiations that have been taking place over the last week. Hisham, if we could just start by talking about what's happened most recently. So last week in Sana'a and with the prisoner swaps, could you just give us a quick breakdown on your views on what's just happened?
Well, we've had the second largest prisoner swap last week over the weekend. Which was indicative of some progress in the peace process in Yemen. And of course, when I say the peace process, I mean the overarching roadmap that has been in discussion for the past almost 8 years since the beginning of the conflict, with not much of a progress. The thing is, now the Saudis, with the direct talks with the Houthis, have kind of restarted that process. There was a limbo in that process. But the thing is, a lot of people are conflating the Saudi-Houthi talks with an end to the Yemeni conflict. People tend to forget that the Yemeni conflict is very complex. It's multi-layered. It's multi-party conflict. It's not just between the Houthis and the Saudis. So even if the regional conflict, the regional aspect of the conflict ends with the Saudis' involvement in Yemen and their battle with the Houthis, that does not necessarily mean it's going to bring about an end to the multiple internal conflicts inside the country. That will take a while, especially when the current peace process that I just mentioned earlier is not all-inclusive yet. Even the UN process was largely focused between the Yemeni government and the Houthis, when over the course of the past 8 years, to have been multiple additional factions entering the ring. The Southern Transitional Council is a good example of that. And they have nominal control of the temporary capital in Aden. So they cannot just be ignored. They cannot just be marginalized. They're a powerful player on the board. You have the national resistance from the Western Coast as well. That's another powerful player on the board. You have other parties, local parties on the ground, and tribal parties on the ground as well. And places like that, you have multiple factions in control of bits and parts of the city. You have to bring those people to the negotiating table as well. So it's, I think it's a bit superficial, and it's a bit overly simplistic for people to think that even the current talks are going to bring about an end to the Yemeni conflict. People need to start asking questions such as, what is the Yemeni conflict? How many layers does the Yemeni conflict have? What are the roots of that conflict? Are those things being addressed? So far, we don't have a holistic, comprehensive, and deep enough process to resolve all those issues.
So yeah, let's just break that down a bit. So when we talk about the Yemeni conflict, as you say, it's multi-layered. If we're talking about an end in the first instance to, for example, the involvement of the Saudi-led coalition in having, airstrikes, boots on the ground, these sorts of things, could that be achieved through these talks in the first instance?
Yes, I believe what you're referring to is the ceasefire, basically between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis, and that has been in effect for the past few months. The thing is, that did not bring an end to the fighting on the ground. Houthis are still pushing in places like Shabwa and Marib. There's been fighting on the western coast, skirmishes. There's been fighting in places like Adala in the south and in places like Taiz. So while on that level, at that layer, as you just said, we could be hopeful, and it will be really helpful for the Saudi-led coalition to cease, for instance, the airstrikes and the Saudis seizing the cross-border attacks and sending ballistic missiles to Aramco, places like Aramco installations. Again, what does that mean to Yemenis? There are 30 million people held hostage to this conflict and suffering from the internal fighting inside the country. Did we bring about a ceasefire inside the country? Not yet.
Can we see a sliver of hope coming for those people that you mentioned? And at this point, it would be good just to paint a picture of what has been called by many people as the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
Yes, we can.
What is the daily reality for Yemenis at the minute?
Okay,
especially in the where the conflict is raging, still raging, or has been.
There is hope. I mean, even the ceasefire agreement, even though it wasn't a complete ceasefire, there was a lot of de-escalation. Let's be honest here. There was a lot of de-escalation, and there was a bit of an improvement in the status quo inside the country. The thing is that a lot of people were hoping for more after 8 years of this back and forth, and management of expectations should have been done in a much better way when people introduced the current process. In terms of the humanitarian situation on the ground, it's very devastating. You're talking about almost more than 80% of the population in need of some form of aid. That's about 22 million people. And 2/3 of the population who are food insecure. 50% of our hospitals are not functional, and the ones that are still in operation are barely functional. We lack clean water, electricity. The rate of unemployment has skyrocketed, as you can imagine, because of the war. There was a lot of capital flight. The infrastructure has been devastated. So people were basically lost their jobs. And when you go to the public sector, salaries have stopped being paid for the longest time. And this is why that's one of the main issues in the negotiations is the payment of public salaries. Because although it's very little, it's still a lifeline to a lot of families inside the country. Now, the situation, the humanitarian situation, kept getting worse over the past 8 years. Aid could not keep up. Not only that, but solutions that have been introduced to Yemen were not sustainable. So you ended up in this situation where each year there's exceeding demands and programs and projects that are catching up to that. And on top of all of it, aid has been cut down in the last year. A lot of aid has been diverted to Ukraine. A lot of governments have had to deal with COVID ramifications, so they cut the aid to Yemen. So the situation just got worse, and it will get worse. A few months ago, there was a donor conference just to fund 1 year's plan in Yemen, 1 year's UN plan in Yemen. And we couldn't even raise half the funding required. So it's a very desperate situation, honestly. This is one of the reasons, for instance, when we were discussing about the existence of child soldiers, child brides, and a lot of people are joining the fronts. It's not because of the ideology. It's not because of the ignorance. It's because of poverty. A lot of people are trying to put bread on their tables. They're trying to feed their families. So when these fighting parties come to me and they say, here's $50 per month, which is a lot in Yemen. Here's $50 per month. Why don't you join the fight? Here's an AK-47. Even if I'm not politically invested, I need to feed my family, so I'll go and fight.
Yeah. And what are you hearing from friends, family, other people in Yemen about access to things like medicine, basic medicines, water, food? You know, how easy or hard is it for people on that sort of level?
It depends. It depends where you are inside the country. And some areas are very desolate. And in places like Hodeidah and places like Hajjah, it's extremely difficult. And especially in areas where there are IDPs, we have almost 4 million IDPs in Yemen. That's huge.
Internally displaced people.
Yes, the internally displaced people. So it's really desperate in those camps and the IDP camps. Inside cities, it's a bit better, but the thing is, it's now because of the war economy, it's a very kind of pyramid-like economy. So you have people at the top who can afford things, and things are available, are being made available to them. But the majority of the people cannot afford medicine, cannot afford gas, cannot afford clean water. And for instance, and I remember this is one of the things why the Houthis were quite upset with me back at the time when I started exposing these inequalities, this injustice inside Sana'a. And I remember people calling me and saying, newspapers and news outlets calling and saying, we hear about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen on brink of famine. That means there's virtually no food in Yemen. And I remember taking my camera and showing the people that I'm like, there is food on the shelves in these groceries, in these upscale areas. But the thing is, 95 to 98% of the population cannot afford that. Yeah. It's only very few handful of families and this elite strata of people that can afford it. And they're usually Houthis. And you go down the street and you can see a Porsche being driven by a Houthi, or the latest Range Rover, or a Rolls Royce, while the majority of the population cannot even afford gas. They've already sold the cars. They've already they can't even afford transportation. They're walking on foot. Because of this disparity, and I was trying to highlight that disparity, and because there was a lot of misinformation back at the time during the war, people didn't realize that it's not just a lack of resources, but it's because of the systemic corruption, nepotism that has been going on inside the country. And if we're being completely honest, because also of the mismanagement of aid money of donor money by aid organizations inside the country.
Yeah. And if we just come now to what happened last month in terms of this re-establishing of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by China, but by all accounts. What did you make of that situation? Were you surprised?
Not really, to be honest. I wasn't. The thing is, Saudis have been on a path of de-escalation for the past, since the end of last year. Remember how they reached out to Syria, how they reached out to Turkey, they reached out to Qatar. So they've been mending their bridges. And they've been moving east instead of west. They've been in talks with Russia, they've been in talks with China, they've been improving their relationships. So to us in the Arab region, that didn't come as a surprise. And I remember a lot of people in the West are like, oh, how dare they? Did they actually do that? And we're like, what did you expect? I mean, you could not contain them, you could not mend those bridges, so they went east. And even when they mended the bridges with Iran, it was inevitable. No war goes on forever. And they realized that for their own peace of mind, for their own sustainable future, they needed to put out all these fires around them. And they started doing that, which is wise, honestly. And part of what they're doing in Yemen basically is part of that policy. They're seeking an exit strategy out of Yemen. Yemen has been Saudi's Vietnam. It's been a quagmire, quicksand for them. So they've been trying to extricate themselves out of Yemen. And they've been making a lot of concessions towards that end. That's why you've seen the Saudis come all the way to Sana'a and willing to extend the olive branch to the Houthis. And when the Houthis, some of their concessions were a bit over the top, the Saudis still were willing to furnish those requests. Payment of salaries by the Saudis, lifting of all import restrictions at Hodeidah, opening of the ports in Sana'a, the airport in Sana'a, and even completely marginalizing the issues in Taz, which is a priority that has been there's been a public outcry to deal with Taz and lift the siege in Taz. But again, that issue has been, dropped down the priority list just for the sake of striking a deal with the Houthis. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this did not make a lot of people happy inside Yemen because Houthis are not Yemen. A lot of people were left twiddling their thumbs in the past years and thinking, what about us? Does this mean legitimizing the Houthis? Does that mean that the Yemeni government will never return to Sana'a? Does that mean that now, for people who live in Sana'a, it's going to be the prevalent status quo is going to be the reality? There's going to be an international recognition of the Houthis, and we'll have to live under their rule for the next 20 to 30 years.
We're gonna get to that. That's a very, very important part of the conversation. What I wanted to ask was, I found what you said very interesting back there, because for people that haven't been watching closely, they might have been surprised by how quickly it went from the establishing of relations between Saudi and Iran to these, limited peace negotiations, let's call them. But you say this has been a long time coming. The Saudis have been wanting to get out of Yemen for quite a long time.
Yeah, they have been. I mean, I remember at the beginning of the conflict, the Saudis were like, we'll be in and out within a few weeks, destroy the Houthis, pick them out of Sana'a, and we'll get to celebrate victory by midsummer. That did not happen. To a lot of us in Yemen, when we heard those statements, we were laughing because this wasn't our first rodeo in Yemen. We've had multiple wars in just the past few decades. We know we've had the Egyptians come into Yemen and thinking they could score a victory and leave. We've had wars with Saudis, across border wars in the past as well. And we've had internal civil wars. We know how long they can drag, and we know our capabilities. So when the Saudis said that, and we were like, we're not just skeptical, we were laughing, honestly. And I remember being on TV back at the time and thinking, yeah, that's not going to happen. And I was telling the world that it would be near impossible for the Saudis to just beat Yemen through an aerial bombardment campaign. And if they would try to push on the ground, they'd be slaughtered. Yemenis are excellent fighters. I mean, I don't mean to brag as a Yemeni, but we're really, really, really good fighters, and we know our terrain.
There's a lot of guns in Yemen, isn't there?
There's a lot of guns, and I mean, my gift when I was 12 years old was a gun, and by 14 and 16, you really know how to use an AK-47. You're really good at it.
I think, yeah, there's more guns per capita than any country, something like that.
Yep. We're only second to the US.
Okay. And speaking of the US, noticeably not very present in anything that's been happening over the last few months on the surface anyway.
They have been, but not over the last few weeks. I wouldn't say the last few months.
Yeah.
Because the Saudis kind of pulled the rug from underneath everyone with the Houthis outreach. And not even the UN was aware of brought into. I remember reading a statement by the UN saying, we were aware, we weren't involved, but we were aware, which gives you an indication that they weren't really consulted. I mean, the Saudis at the end of the day call the shots. They're the puppet masters in this ordeal. And I remember back at the time when the UN was doing consultations before the announcing of the PLC, and the Saudis within I think it was within like 12, 48 hours to 24 hours, they just called everybody and they're like, you know what? We'll do our own parallel consultations to Riyadh. Everybody come in, and they sent tickets and they sent flights, and everybody just showed up in Riyadh. And within 48 hours after that, they announced the Presidential Leadership Council, completely marginalizing the UN and the effort. And they did it again now. So what the UN, what they're doing is very much appreciated. The Saudis, and I know that everybody, it's about keeping up appearances. And the Saudis, of course, there's always this this public presence or public image that they're trying to project that everything is done in tandem. Not really. The Saudis are doing their own thing. They will let you know later on, a later stage, but after they've already secured an agreement or done whatever there's they needed to do. But going back to the Iran and Yemeni conflict, this is one of the issues that we've always talked about early on during the conflict, was that Saudi has always publicized the fight as a fight against Iran inside Yemen. And when they said we're coming in to destroy Iran's capabilities in Sana'a, and everybody was like, by the way, we're south of the border, Iran is north of the border. If you have an issue with Iran, just direct your missiles 180 degrees and just fire it off to the north. So you don't have to punish us for what the Houthis are doing. And if you have something to sort out with the Iranians, just deal with them directly. But it was, of course, it was cheaper, it was less risky. And Yemen has always been a petri dish for resolving regional conflicts. So they did that. And the Saudis, within the first year, of course, they wanted to flex their muscles. They thought it's doable. And of course, there were people inside Yemen, including the Yemeni government, who told them, of course you can. We'll guide you through the process of defeating the Houthis. And they failed within the first few months. Then the first year, and the second year, and it kept dragging on and on and on. And after a few years, the Saudis started to question their own generals. You remember, if the Saudis also fired their own generals, it's not just Yemeni generals. And they changed the government twice. And they replaced a lot of military generals, and it still wasn't fixable. They were still being drained out of resources. And just last year, they were like, that's enough. We need to start cutting our losses. Because the way it's been going on, it's like we've been pulling in a lot of resources and putting it into Yemen with zero results. And that's when you started to hear a lot of people saying, oh, it's a military and political deadlock. There's no military solution to the current conflict. Everybody needs to sit around the table. I'm like, we've been saying that since the beginning of the conflict. But nobody will listen to us. Instead, everybody joined the coalition. Everybody was funding one side or the other. Everybody was happy to sell weapons. And you just made your buck. You made your money. And now that there's no money to be made, everybody is like, let's call it quits. I mean, it's sad. It's a sad reality. But there are a lot of drivers to the current conflict, and a lot of people assume that it's just local. No, it's regional. There is international interest as well. And everybody had an agenda. Yeah. I don't mean to just internationalize the conflict, but everybody had an agenda in Yemen.
And so what about in these talks that have happened last week, brokered by, or at least observed by, an Omani delegation? Do you know which points are going to be discussed in these negotiations specifically?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main issues that are being discussed there is, of course, ending the cross-border attacks, but also providing guarantees. And the other thing is lifting all forms of restrictions and rehabilitating the core infrastructure. Also, what's being discussed is issues relating to power sharing, but also resources sharing and taxation, because the Houthis want their hand in the honeypot. So they're discussing revenues, not just in the areas under the control, but also in areas under the government's control, specifically places like MEMO. They want revenues from there as well. And but having said that, the Saudis, yes, they have the upper hand. Yes, they can commit to things and force the Yemeni government to make those concessions and commit to those as well, or use the Yemeni government as rubber stamp. But the thing is, that would be really problematic, because as soon as you step out of the room, Saudi, people will start fighting inside the room. And I'm talking about Yemen here. People will start fighting internally. People will not accept a model where they basically pay levies and taxes to the Houthis just to appease the Houthis. It's completely imbalanced, that power relationship. Eventually, of course, the Houthis will continue to be brutal, they'll continue to be unjust, and because they feel that they have the upper hand, they will further, I mean, human rights violations are going to continue. There's going to be silencing of dissent, but they will also seek an expansionist agenda. It will not stop in Sana'a. They will want to control Marib. They will want to go down south as well. They will want to control Hodeidah. They will want to evict the forces in the western coast. They want to go down to Dara and Aden as well. They want to move east towards Al-Mahra, towards Shabwa. And they've shown signs of doing that over the past few months when they tried to take some of the districts in Shabwa. So without measures to keep the Houthis in check, without guarantees that as soon as a deal is signed to just stop the cross-border attacks, Houthis will turn inwards and start attacking local parties, we won't have a peace deal. I mean, let's call it what it is. It's a border agreement between the Saudis and the Houthis.
Yeah. And because, eventually what needs to happen is some sort of roadmap for people to govern, someone or some formation of or coalition to govern the country.
Yes.
And I think it would be a good point now to, between us, just quickly thrash out for maybe younger listeners or people that don't know so much about the conflict, who are the key parties there? And I'll quickly go through it, and then you correct me if I get anything wrong.
Sure.
So we have the Houthis, who at the minute they control the north of the country, what was North Yemen, in theory, backed by Iran. In terms of weapons and money and other things. We have the Yemeni government, or the internationally recognized Yemeni government, in alliance with an Arab coalition, Saudi-led Arab coalition of Houthis. And then we have some other players. You mentioned the Southern secessionists, who are they in Aden at the moment, or are they sort of around Aden?
In Aden, in Abiyan, and parts of around Aden, the Southern Transitional Council.
Southern Transitional Council. Other groups, ISIS is there?
Not big. ISIS is not big in Yemen. Al-Qaeda is there. But you also have the national resistance on the western coast. You have some tribal confederations in the east. And you have, of course, a faction in Marib of the Yemeni military, and the Islah Party faction in Marib as well. So it's this is why it can quickly get really complicated once you start to draw a list of how many factions there are in Yemen.
But to slightly simplify it, who should be at the table? Who do you think are the key players here that should be at the table? At
the very least, the Western Coast Forces, the Southern Transitional Council, the Marib tribal leaders, Taz, representatives from Taz, since Taz has been hard hit by the conflict. And of course, if we move towards the east, we need the Mahris and the Suqatris as well to be at the table.
Yeah. And do you think, before we really go into it, I was thinking about the Iraq conflict. It was a conflict, so it was a war by the Americans. They invaded Iraq when it was 20 years on now from the beginning of the invasion. But when they decided on a kind of power sharing agreement, you had three parties really. You had the Shia faction on one side, the Sunnis, and the Kurds. And even, to this day, they have a government whereby a representative from each of those factions has to occupy a certain role within the government. Lots of people say it doesn't work very well. Lots of people said at the beginning that it favored the Shia faction. Is there something that could be learned from how this was all set up by the Americans? And, is there something that could be learned from that?
I cannot talk about that conflict because I honestly don't know much about it. I have recollections of what happened in Iraq, what I've seen in the news, but I'm not that well versed in Iraqi politics. But having said that, the thing is, what we need in Yemen is participatory democracy. You cannot just rely on, yes, an initial agreement could be between the main parties, but we will have to call in for elections. The government cannot be continuously controlled by the handful of parties. We need to kind of encourage active citizenship inside the country. We need local councils elections. We need parliamentary elections so that the people are represented, not the parties. In the beginning of the conflict, everybody is talking about the GPC, the General People's Congress, and the Islah Party being the vastly two dominant parties. If you go now back to Yemen and ask people, which party do you belong to? A lot of people would say, we don't belong to any party. There was a survey that was conducted, was just a year ago, where by the European Institute of Peace, where people were asked, do you feel that you are being represented or are you affiliated with any of the current political parties? 70%, 76% of the population said no. That's a huge number. And it gives you an indication that people no longer trust the current elite who claim to be representing Yemenis. There's this huge disconnect. So in order to have a sustainable peace, an actual democracy, an actual model that would work better than Syria, Iraq, or wherever, we needed to be a bottom-up democracy where people actually, well, this is one of the reasons why we took to the streets in 2011, for not being continuously marginalized. We want to have a say in the running of our country.
So that's a very key point, I think, because clearly in Iraq, sectarianism took over at some point. And who's to say that if they didn't have parties, who's to say that there aren't a portion of the Shia and Sunni population that support this set of policies and another portion that support this set of policies, and therefore they're politically different, even though they've got the same ethnic or religious background. I mean, in a democracy, it doesn't make sense to divide people up by their ethnicity or their...
Exactly. This is one of the things. Yeah, but this is one of the things, for instance, a lot of people in Yemen, when people are asking me, how bad is sectarianism in Yemen? And I would be like, I was never that prominent for the longest time in my life. Since I was born and raised in Yemen, I never knew and I never cared what religious beliefs my neighbor had.
And that's exactly what Iraqis say, pre-2000.
Yeah. But certain parties with vested interests wanted to kind of put that splinter, put that divide between Yemenis, because it served their purposes to it's about divide and rule, and to antagonize groups and create a phenomena of us versus them. Otherwise, every Yemeni would not even listen to you. It'd be like if the Houthis are coming in and saying, like, it is us against the non-believers. At first instance, Yemeni would be like, what non-believers? We're all Muslim. But if you keep repeating that, and you keep showing the other side, or painting the other side, or demonizing the other side, some people would start listening to you. And you would have indoctrinated a portion of the population that could also become a vehicle for basically brainwashing and indoctrinating others. And if you have control over, for instance, educational curriculums, if you have control of the mosques, if you have control of the radio and TV, you'll start also propagating that narrative and that rhetoric over the waves, over the airwaves, and basically create a generation that is filled or misled, but also filled with a lot of hatred, which is very dangerous. Yes, we did not have those notions and those crazy, insane ideas 20 years ago, but we will in the coming 10 to 15. We already have them to a degree, but it's going to get worse. Of this type of propaganda and this hate speech will continue.
Which are you referring to specifically?
On both ends, honestly. The Houthis telling everybody inside Sana'a that the Yemeni government are basically heathens, and the Saudis are not the guardians of Mecca, and they're in cahoots with the Jews and with the Americans. They're coming in here to loot our land. They're coming here to kill our children. You can hear, so there's some really insane conspiracy theories by the way that are being spun in Sana'a. And on the other end, you have, of course, the Yemeni government and the other side and saying, these are Shiites. They're dirty. They're not real Muslims. We are the Sunnis. We are the followers of the Prophet. So it's like you get to a point where people, especially youth in Yemen, will be like, enough with this Shia Sunni thing. Everybody's just painting the other in such an ugly image that I no longer feel that I should be Muslim in the first place. If there's so much bad in Shia and so much bad in Sunni, why should I stay as a Muslim?
Yeah.
And that's why you've seen a spike in people leaving Yemen and saying, I'm no longer a Muslim, I'm a non-believer. And social media is full of those people. And I personally know some of those activists who did that.
Yeah. And so if, let's say, a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire is achieved, just say, how do we get to this point where we're discussing these bigger issues about how to order society and how to create some sort of workable state?
Well, that's the problem we've had over the past. This is not our first ceasefire, by the way. We've had multiple ceasefires in the past. But that has been the issue. Securing a ceasefire became a goal unto itself. And renewing the ceasefire became the goal. I mean, eyes on the ball. The goal is a peace process, a sustainable peace process, not the ceasefire.
Yeah.
And because a lot of people were working on an ad hoc basis, they were just focused on getting a ceasefire and renewing it, but not that much interested in making or creating a roadmap for political inclusion, or dealing with past injustice, accountability, restorative justice, none of that. So much so that they weren't talking to the right people. They were talking to people at the top because it's easier. So you invite a handful of elites, you talk to them, take a photo, and slam that photo up on a press release, and just say, we're doing something. And it's just a never-ending story. And you've been doing that for the past 8 years. And if we're being honest, you've been doing that for the past 12 years since the UN got involved in 2011. But again, as I mentioned earlier, what we need is a very, bottom-up approach, definitely a bottom-up approach, but also a holistic, comprehensive approach. Something that deals with all these layers of the Yemeni conflict, addresses the roots of the conflict, gets buy-in, not from the elites, buy-in from the general masses as well.
And
Without that, I don't think anything's going to stick. It's not going to stick.
And do you think there should be an exploration of the role of international governments, foreign governments in the conflict? Should that be part of any truth and justice, committee or talks?
I mean, let's be honest. There will never be a time when they're not involved. They will be involved, whether we like it or we don't, one way or the other.
Just with Britain, for instance, this is a country that I'm in at the minute that colonized southern Yemen, or had the port of Aden as its stop-off point for the East India Company for 130 years. It was colonized up until 1968. We hear no news of what happens in Yemen, even when there was peace talks and prisoner swaps. Barely anything on the BBC. Not interested. They supplied arms to Saudi Arabia throughout the conflict, and that was something that the news did occasionally bring up. People in Britain weren't happy about that. Should they be made to play a role in helping Yemen to recover and stabilize itself?
Well, the UK is a pen holder at the UN of the Yemen conflict, the Yemen peace process. And we wanted a greater role in mediating between the factions, but also in providing aid to Yemenis. The latter has been cut down, citing multiple reasons by the UK government. And the former, we've seen diminishing UK role in Yemen. It's as if they too not just dropped the ball, but seeking an exit strategy. I mean, I remember there was a point where the UK was seen as championing the cause in Yemen, but they no longer do. And I remember when we started noticing this trend, and I was asked the question, why do you think that is? And I said, one good reason is because the Brits don't want to upset the Saudis. They don't want to step on Saudis' toes. So they're like, Saudis can do whatever they want with Yemen. And for the sake of our relationship with the Saudis, we have greater economic interests, military and strategic interests with Saudi. Yemen will be the pound of flesh. We're not getting that much out of Yemen anyway. So they pulled back.
Yeah. And after all, it seems the Saudis are looking east anyway these days, towards China.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, it's kind of funny, honestly, to us Yemenis for watching what's happening, is because the West bent backwards to appease and win over the Saudis. And now, after everything that's done, I remember back at the time, since the beginning of the conflict, we were like, why aren't you condemning the Saudis? Why aren't you putting a stop to this? Especially when the Saudis were bombing hospitals, bombing orphanages, and they were committing insane and horrific atrocities inside Yemen. And the West would be like, oh, well, it's the Houthis. Oh, well, they're putting their thumbs. And we're like, we knew that you will never sacrifice your relationship with the Saudis for Yemeni's sakes. But now the Saudis have sacrificed you. And they're going east. And they're doing their own thing. And I remember how the Saudis stood vis-a-vis what's happening in Ukraine. And when the West was upset that the Saudis and the UAE as well didn't adopt a stronger stance along with the Europeans. And we were like, that relationship was very transactional.
Yeah.
And so when the Saudis saw a better deal, they took it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it certainly wasn't based on a shared view of the world or
no
ideology. And I do wonder if the Americans will kind of come back into the picture at some stage. Of course, before even 2011, there was this drone campaign in response to Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There was a lot of US aid money going into the country for Ali Abdullah Saleh to stop Al Qaeda, but obviously he was known for playing lots of different sides, spinning lots of different plates, and kind of playing his own game. How did that situation with the rise of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula take us into the Arab Spring, and then how do we get from there to the war?
Well, they're not interlinked. It was one of the drivers of the conflict, but they didn't have that much of an impact. The thing is, the Arab Spring was a region-wide phenomenon, and it's partly driven, yes, by public need for transparency, for democracy, curbing because of the mismanagement of the state affairs, and also curbing of corruption. But it was also driven by political parties who basically wanted to get rid of their opponents. This is one of the reasons why, as soon as it started, the Arab Spring in Yemen, Saleh's opposition quickly joined the change square. Why the Houthis joined the change square? Why even Saleh's second in command, Ali Muhsin, change square? Because he was like, you know what? This is my opportunity to topple Saleh. And basically, this is going to be my next 30 years of rule, as Saleh had it in the past. But they miscalculated. And I remember I used to do interviews from Change Square while we were very independent activists, while we were very excited in the beginning, and people were like, it's not about just removing Saleh. We have nothing against the man personally. It's about his mismanagement. It's about this whole structure inside the country, corruption and what have you. We wanted a change of the regime. And I remember within the first few weeks, it was all fine. We had dreams, we had aspirations, but quickly I saw the regime's leaders, the corrupt regime leaders, next to my tent. The guy that I was like, I actually criticized for stealing massive amounts of public funding. He's here next to me and he's like, yes, down with the regime. And I'm like, what the hell? What are you doing here? But quickly, the uprising was hijacked by the very same corrupt politicians and political parties.
So they saw which way the wind was blowing and kind of joined the opposition.
They rode that wave, exactly.
Yeah.
And suddenly, was Saleh and these parties signing an agreement, reboxing the regime, while everybody else was completely out of the picture and thrown out of the picture. And you've seen the results of that. We had the National Dialogue Conference, which did not amount to anything. We had, I believe it was something like 1,800 recommendations, none of it was implemented. And the results, the outcomes were not binding. And of course, because of it, we had a fallout, especially in terms of the division of the country into whether it be a federal system or a centralized system and a Republican system. And the Houthis moved into Sana'a. So basically, they were like, you know what, the government is weak. Saleh, of course, partnered with them. They're like, the JMP, the joint meeting of political parties, was the opposition. And the JMP, basically, we could kick them out of the country, even though we signed the GCC agreement. And they did that near end of 2014. By 2015, when they chased out the government all the way to Aden and also out of Aden, the Saudis were like, you know what? this whole thing has been done under our own auspices, so we need to step in. And convinced by Yemeni military generals, they thought they would have an easy win. But also the Saudis had their own vested interests, because the Saudis needed to quell the rebellion in the south of the border, but also they had their own internal reasons. They had their own internal dynamics, and it always helps to have an external war to unify internal ranks, always helps to force us rise through the ranks as a war champion.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it. There was multiple reasons for that. They did it. And we were caught in that storm. Yemenis, I mean, when I say we, like average Yemenis like myself, we were caught in that storm. And we paid the heaviest price.
Yeah. And before the conflict had even started, Yemen was the poorest country in the Middle East, certainly had already had quite a few issues in terms of water shortages and and other things which really haven't gone away. So my final question, it's been a great discussion. We've covered a lot of topics, but my final question would be, if a peace process is established, what's the first thing that should be done in your view? Where do we start?
That's a very excellent question. People have reached this level of fatigue where they don't trust in the peace process anymore. You can preach and parade the peace process however you want and spin it on 1,000 axes, but without local buy-in, you won't get far. What the international community needs to know, what the UN needs to know, is that you can have all your little meetings, you can have all your follow-ups, but without a bottom-up approach, without bringing in Yemenis into the process, it will not be sustainable. First of all, it's going to be a skewed process based on the wrong kind of input. You need to ask Yemenis directly what they want in terms of demands of the shape or the framework of the peace process. To a lot of Yemenis, for instance, before anything, they want improvement in basic services, livelihoods, security, protections from human rights violations. Those are the basics. They need peace dividends. Once you have that in place, once people can sit down and think straight, that will help you in building some sort of a roadmap for the peace process. They will be able to tell you, if you want peace in Taz, you need, for instance, to remove all the militias outside the city. You need to fix the water shortage issues that you just mentioned, because that's one of the reasons of the conflict. You need to fix the roads, to improve roads, because fixing of roads and lifting the siege will improve livelihoods. It will restart the economy. Once you have that in place, people will move beyond that. The fighters will return from the fighting fronts and start picking up jobs, looking after their own families. There's going to be a de-escalation. There's going to be less animosity. Then they'll be more likely to engage politically. There needs to be a restoration of relationships between Yemenis. There needs to be, again, you mentioned truth committees, you mentioned earlier some kind of processes that need to be set in place. That kind of discussion will be had by that time. But without all of that, we're not going to get far. And as I said earlier in the beginning, what we need, I know it sounds simplistic when I keep repeating it, but in all honesty, we need a very holistic and comprehensive process that addresses the roots of the conflict, but also the multi-layered war in Yemen.
And I think that's a pretty good place to end it. And Hisham, thanks very much for coming on to the MEMO in Conversation with podcast.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for having me.
I hope we can get to this process soon and stop the suffering.
Likewise. Well, thank you, Alex. It's been fun.